Hey everybody, so I know this is a blatant clickbait video, but I honestly can't help myself. You guys have to watch this interview that Ben Shapiro did with Andrew Neil on the BBC, which just went totally haywire. It's hilarious. Um, Andrew Neil, if you guys aren't familiar with him, is one of the most prominent conservative media figures in the UK. He's the chairman of the Spectator magazine, which is the most illustrious conservative magazine in the UK, and which actually has an American division now that I contribute to. So they're conservative, they're associated with the Tory party, blah, blah, blah. But they allow something of a wide spectrum of contributors. So at least for the American division, I'm able to write basically whatever I want for them, which is something I appreciate. But Andrew Neil invited Ben Shapiro on to the BBC because he's also a broadcaster. He presents a lot of BBC programming and actually programming for other networks. But yeah, I mean, you gotta watch this. It's so funny because at a certain point, and I'll post the entire thing in the description box. But at a certain point, Andrew Neil brings up this abortion law that was recently enacted in Georgia, which criminalizes abortion at a relatively early period in a woman's pregnancy. And Andrew Neil was asking Ben Shapiro, who supports this, isn't that barbaric, etc. And Ben Shapiro couldn't handle it. He went on this rant about how Andrew Neil is some kind of secret leftist pushing his agenda surreptitiously through the BBC. And Shapiro demanded that Andrew Neil come clean and just admit that he's this, wild-eyed leftist and stop deceiving his viewers. And if you know anything at all about Andrew Neil, and I'm an American, I occasionally consume British media, so I actually know more about the UK journalism landscape than most Americans, granted, but nonetheless, if you even Googled Andrew Neil and did about 10 seconds worth of research, you would have known that he is not a leftist and actually is hated by the actual leftists in the UK in large part. But part of the ethos in the UK is that you have journalists who are more transparent than in the US about their political views, acting in a somewhat objective capacity, but not in a phony way. They admit their leanings politically, but nonetheless, when they're interviewing a politician, they ask adversarial questions. And in fact, if you don't ask adversarial questions in the UK, you're ridiculed, and you're not considered a proper journalist, for the most part, at least in the kind of more mainstream spheres of the media. And that's what Andrew Neil was doing with Ben Shapiro. I mean, if you watch Andrew Neil interviewing members of the Labour Party, left-wing journalists, he does the same exact thing, meaning he asks them aggressively probing, antagonistic questions. That's just in the ether in the UK media to a degree that doesn't really exist in the US, although, I mean, things are changing and media ethics are kind of evolving in both countries. But if you just watch how Ben Shapiro handled this interview, he seemed aghast that anybody would be asking him critical questions because I guess he's used to people kissing his ass for the most part in the U.S. when he does, friendly talk radio or even Fox News. And I also do Fox News, and, to be honest, I'm not asked adversarial questions in that context typically. But nonetheless, I try to seek out people who don't agree with me and do interviews with them and even quasi-debates. That's what I did with Benjamin Wittes for my most recent podcast. But Ben Shapiro is just totally unaccustomed to this. I know he has this whole brand where he wanted to go around and debating people, but the people who he tends to debate, correct me if I'm wrong, are mentally unstable college students who come to his lectures that he gets paid a boatload for, and who he can just talk over in his rapid-fire delivery and make to look like idiots. So those don't really seem like the most worthy competitors to me, debate-wise, but that's where Ben Shapiro got his reputation for being willing to debate anybody. And he's so brave and intrepid and wanted to go around and have his views tested even before hostile audiences. He doesn't really do that. I know he's done occasional debates with people who aren't the brightest, bulbs in the chandelier, to be frank, but it's all just to say that you could tell how totally unfamiliar this kind of interview setting was for him. And let me just reiterate. Andrew Neil was the editor of the Sunday Times, the flagship Tory newspaper in the UK. He was a founding chairman of Sky News, which was Rupert Murdoch's, rough equivalent of Fox News, although not quite, in the UK. And he's currently the head of The Spectator. So, for Ben Shapiro to just wildly accuse him of somehow being a secret leftist is like everybody across the UK was laughing at that. Like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. But Ben Shapiro admitted that he didn't do any research on Andrew Neil. He, I guess, tweeted an apology of sorts afterwards saying, "Oh, I didn't know that you're not, some kind of Antifa or something." Just look at Andrew Neil, okay? That's just so absurd. And Andrew Neil, when Ben Shapiro leveled that accusation, dismissed it as ridiculous, and he was right. But it's just because Ben Shapiro is so utterly unaccustomed to that kind of questioning. Anyway, you just watch the entire thing. It's so funny. I have been, challenging Ben Shapiro to a debate, via Twitter mostly, for a couple months now. Because, number one, he only debates, mentally unstable college students, seemingly. And number two, his views about Israel and foreign policy and Ilhan Omar in particular totally fly in the face of this general image that he likes to present of somebody who's just very much tethered to reason and only wanting facts, not feelings. And, denigrating anybody who seems to have overly emotional reactions to political events. And I agree that emotional reactions to political events do tend to cloud people's rational faculties and their ability to reason. But Ben Shapiro engaged in exactly the same conduct with regard to Ilhan Omar in Israel. He said how offended he was that Ilhan Omar could have suggested that there was a pro-Israel lobby in the U.S. that uses money and influence to attempt to dictate U.S. policy, which is just an obvious truth, indisputably so. He was, launching these accusations of anti-Semitism to trying to use a slur to stifle debate, even though the points that Ilhan Omar raised were obviously factually true. But rather than address them on the merits, Ben Shapiro decided to scream anti-Semitism, which is exactly the thing he accuses others of doing, on the left, when they shout racism or sexism to shut down debate. Ben Shapiro was emulating those exact same qualities. And he does it because of his wider perspective on Israel and his intense religious and political devotion to the Jewish state. So, my feeling was, hey, Ben, let's debate this. Let's air it all out. Don't settle for some 19-year-old at Barnard or something who obviously is not in the habit of debating in public venues with somebody who obviously can just speed talk and use kind of, logical fallacies to bowl people over. And he hasn't responded, which, was expected. But I think I could utterly destroy him, to use the YouTube title cliche, if you were willing to do it. And I don't think so, but, the offer is actually genuine. Could be a time and location of his choice. I'll happily pay my own expense to travel there. And we can see who has the better arguments with regard to U.S. foreign policy, which he always has a neocon leaning, traditional quote unquote view that's emblematic of the George W. Bush period. With regard to Israel, which he's always defending, I don't see much criticism from him on Israel, except maybe very minor gradations of whatever the Israeli government happens to be doing. Usually his criticism is that they're not aggressive enough with regard to, punishing Gazans or, subjugating people who live in the West Bank. So I also like to debate, his views on Judaism. I'm irreligious, or I'm, non-theistic. He's a diehard monotheist, which, it's fine, but that kind of has an impact on how we see the world, and it would be great to discuss those issues. And I also think his treatment of Ilhan Omar, you could have plenty of valid criticisms of Omar if you want. She's a member of Congress, fine. But to just kind of screech that you're an anti-Semite. So again, as to shut down debate, which is flatly contradictory to everything he purports to stand for, was insanely hypocritical, and other members of the intellectual, quote, dark web did exactly the same thing during that period. And actually, I wrote a piece that was supposed to come out in late March on this. I was going through the editing process, and that was exactly when the Mueller report got issued, so I had to put it on the shelf for a while, but I'll get back to that at some point. Anyway, I just wanted to do a quick video. Like I said, I couldn't resist. And I'll talk to you later.